Welcome to the Inspire Health Podcast. Your life is about to get a whole lot better. Have you ever felt like you tried everything and yet still couldn't find the answers or the solutions that you were seeking? Whether you're dealing with chronic illness, physical or emotional pain, I want you to know that your body is the most sophisticated machine on planet Earth. Your body holds unfathomable wisdom. Trust in it and learn from it. Know that there are answers and there are solutions to your specific health challenges. And we will be uncovering all of them here on the Inspire Health Podcast. I'm so excited to be a part of your healing journey. Your transformation starts now. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Inspire Health Podcast, and thanks for tuning in. We are continuing on with our 10-part series on yoga, finding calm amidst the storm. I'm super excited for today's guest, who is Stephen Cope. Stephen is a best-selling author and scholar who specializes in the relationship between the Eastern contemplative traditions and Western depth psychology. Among his seminal works in this area are Yoga and the Quest for the True Self, The Wisdom of Yoga, and The Great Works of Your Life. His most recent work, Deep Human Connection, is an examination of the psychology, neurobiology, and spirituality of deep human connection and the imperatives of human attachment, an issue of great importance to both the Eastern and Western traditions. For almost 30 years, Stephen has been scholar in residence at the renowned Kripalu Center, the largest center for the study and practice of yoga in the Western world. Kripalu hosts almost 50,000 guests a year in its many yoga, meditation, and personal growth programs. It is located on the sprawling 200-acre estate in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. In addition to his role as scholar in residence, Stephen is the founder and former director of the Kripalu Institute for Extraordinary Living, one of the world's most influential research institutes examining the effects and mechanisms of yoga and meditation with a team of researchers from Harvard Medical School, University of Connecticut, University of Pennsylvania, and many more. Stephen is the recipient of both a Telly and an Apple Award for his work. In its 25th anniversary edition, Yoga Journal named him one of the most influential thinkers, writers, and teachers on the current American yoga scene. Stephen, what a pleasure to have you here today.
Delighted to be here, Jason. Nice to meet you.
Yes, exactly. This is kind of how it is anyways for people. It's all virtual meetings right at the moment. So.
Exactly. I'm getting familiar with Zoom in a way I hadn't been before.
I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, and they said that their in-laws had dropped off meals for everybody for Passover, and then they all did a Skype event so that they all got to actually eat their meals at the same time and have Passover together at the same time. And he said it's actually a lot like dating. Like you're starting to figure out new and innovative ways to connect with people that you wouldn't have thought of when you kind of take things for granted. So
this is Match.com.
Yeah. So Stephen, I came across your work about 6 or 7 years ago, and it was around Christmas, and a really good friend of mine had given me this book of yours, The Great Works of Your Life. And I really fell in love with your work after that. It was such a perfect time to get it. I had really dived into the world of yoga and had done a yoga teacher training and was putting stuff together, and it was just really getting into the depth of some of the philosophy and the practice of yoga. And I really love the way that your writing brought a lot of that together. So I was really excited to be able to bring you on the show today and talk to you about it all.
Thanks, Jason.
So I've got lots of questions. So maybe what we can start with is you've got a pretty diverse background, and I would love to hear your story on how you ended up immersed in the world of yoga, and particularly your path to really knowing who you were and finding out your Dharma.
Yeah, sure. So I really came into the yoga world through Buddhism. When I was in graduate school, I went to Boston College in Boston, and every day I'd walk past what was clearly a meditation center, and there was a big glass window, and there were 30 people just sitting there, sitting for an hour with their hands crossed. And I hadn't been introduced to meditation. It turned out to be one of the centers for Trungpa Rinpoche, one of the great crazy wisdom gurus of the late 20th century. And I went in one day and I said, what are you guys doing? And he said, well, we're doing meditation. You want to join? Sit down. He said, just sit. I'll train you later. So I sat down. I was completely at sea, but I got the training and I dropped into it, Jason. Really, it was just natural for me. This makes one believe in multiple births, and because there was something about the Dharma when I was introduced to it that absolutely lit me up. It was almost like I recognized it. And so I started dropping into that center every day after graduate school and got deeply into the practice of Buddhist meditation. I was 25 at that time. And a few years later, a buddy of mine started introducing me to yoga postures and explained that the postures are really a preparation. And in classical yoga, of course, the postures and breathing is a preparation for meditation. And so I thought, this is great. This will prepare me for meditation. I also I had been a dancer. So my first career after college was in ballet and modern dance. So I took to the postures like a duck to water, and I very quickly developed a meditation and a yoga practice. Um, I went through a lot of this is detailed in my first book, Yoga and the Quest for the True Self. I went through a kind of midlife breakdown at 40 when my ex-partner and I broke up. And you know, I was in that place where I was really broken open. And when you're really broken open in that way, you're very available to spiritual teachings. So a lot of the greatest spiritual writing, for example, the Bhagavad Gita, at the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna is on the floor of his chariot. So I was broken open, and I was either going to go to an Episcopal monastery for a year to do a year of meditation and contemplation, or I was going to go to Kripalu. And my buddy took me out to Kripalu, and I saw it, and I fell in love with it. And he also said, look, if you go to the monastery, you'll get fat because all of the monks are fat. This is a more holistic way to go. So I actually had my name on an Episcopal monastery in Boston on a door, one of they call them the cells, the bedroom doors. And we took that off, and I went to Kripalu. The Kripalu community at that point was a very large, very diverse, but extremely creative community. So there were a lot of brilliant people there. There were about 350 of us living there when I moved. I moved in and I was 40 years old, and this was in 1989. So that was 30 years ago. And it was a big, sprawling, lively community. And we had a resident guru, Amrit Desai, who was also very bright and charismatic. And they were very interested in my background in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. And so once again, it fit kind of like a glove. And I was meant to go back to my psychotherapy practice after that, but I never did. I stayed at Kripalu, and I was there for 30 years. I'm now emeritus there, so I still have an office there, but mostly I write here in my office in Albany.
Nice. Well, if anybody hasn't been to Kripalu, it's one of the nicest places in the world in my mind. My wife and I have done many courses there, and
Thank you.
it's some of our favorite places to be. And yeah, it really is a special place, and I can imagine why it's a good place for you, probably for writing and everything too. I mean, you've got everything
It's
just
very
lined up.
quiet. It's very quiet and contemplative. It was, of course, a Jesuit novitiate. So it was built originally for the baby Jesuits in the 60s. And then that stream of baby Jesuits dried up a little bit in the 60s. And we bought it in 1983 and have been there ever since. For those of you who haven't been there, it's up on a mountaintop in the Berkshires. It's quiet and lovely. And thank you for saying so.
Mhm. Oh yeah, we love it. It's interesting you talked about breakup too. I find this really fascinating. It's like these breakups tend to, like you said, almost break you open, wide open for something new to happen. And most of my biggest lessons have been actually following breakups too. I remember I think I got mostly into some of the even Buddhist teachings probably over 20 years ago with a really challenging breakup. And I remember the first book I started reading was Pema Chodron's When Things Fall Apart. And
Oh, when things fall apart.
and I
That's
was like,
great.
well, that just seems perfect. So,
Yeah.
but what I found was like I couldn't wait to read. I would read a chapter and then I would be practicing that for the next few
Yeah.
days. And then I would read the next, and I couldn't wait to get back. It felt like being embraced with a warm hug with every chapter. And it was just like soul food. It was just soul food for me.
Because it goes directly at suffering. And the Buddhists are brilliant in talking about suffering and exactly what it is and how it works and how it can actually be attenuated. So if you're suffering, that's definitely the way to go. And I didn't actually come into it suffering, but when I started really suffering, and there's nothing that breaks you open more than a heartbreak like that,
Hmm.
then I really dug deep. And that's when I started doing long retreats up in Vermont and at Kripalu and IMS and so forth. So yeah, I get you there, Jason.
Hmm. Yeah, but really so vital for part of the process too, I think. So now you had mentioned, Stephen, your psychotherapy as well. How did you find those two worlds blended? Because I think they really are quite a wonderful blend, but the world of psychotherapy and Western psychology and then the Eastern traditions and yoga, what what really overlapped well or complemented each other that really drew you?
Well, it's funny. When I started, it was back in the 70s, and I was in Boston, which is a very heavily traditional psychoanalytic place. And honestly, they were not open to meditation at all in the 70s. I actually didn't get a couple of jobs that I was interviewing for because I brought up the fact that I was a meditator and that I might occasionally use meditation as an adjunctive treatment, and people rolled their eyes at that. And those were the days when, if you went to a wedding and said, when people ask you what you did, that you're a yoga teacher, everybody's head swiveled to the next person. And then in the 80s and 90s, of course, and in the early 2000s, it was really the advent of positive psychology where forward-thinking psychotherapists were really looking at what the contemplative traditions had to offer. And the Dalai Lama began having his regular annual or biannual mind and life meetings, where he would invite a whole cadre of great Western scientists and neuroscientists and psychologists, and they'd have these week-long confabs where they'd describe their understanding of the human mind. And a lot of these psychologists, some of whom are friends of mine, Dan Goleman, for example, came back saying, wow, these traditions are a gold mine of understanding, not only about suffering and the negative sides of human experience, but about about positive states and positive mind states. There was one great confab that they had when they talked all about the West's very comprehensive understanding of hate and anger and resentment and the kind of negative mind states. And then those psychologists were asked to talk about the so-called.
Can you hear me, Stephen?
There you are.
There we go. Sorry about that. I think we had like a power off here for a second or something like
Oh,
that.
okay. No problem. Just,
Okay.
I thought I'd lost you. All of a sudden it was only me. Um, so, so really over the course of my professional life, these contemplative practices have become much more well understood, and we now can find ways to integrate them. Because I've written a lot about the Yoga Sutra, for example, which is really the yoga tradition of depth psychology. And the Sigmund Freud's great vision of psychoanalysis was, he said, psychoanalysis is to treat self-deception, the problem of self-deception. That is, the fact that we are capable of keeping whole aspects of our mental life and mental functioning from ourselves. And of course, the Buddha himself said all men are quite deluded. So this whole idea that we're deluded and need systematic practices to help us get back in touch with who we are, what our defenses are, what our suffering is really about. Freud and the contemplative traditions have a lot in common. They're both really depth psychologies.
I think it's fascinating. One of the series that we're putting currently together is one on trauma. And so I'm talking to a lot of the main people in trauma right at the moment. And what's really fascinating is that the newest, shouldn't say trend, but the newest sort of treatments that are coming up now around trauma, they're all coming back to these concepts of body-centered psychotherapy, and which a lot of it ties back to mindfulness, meditation, moving your body, yoga, all of the stuff that we've been taught for thousands and thousands of years. It's just now it's making sense to them in a way that I think a lot of times in the Western world, we need to understand things before we're okay with applying it.
Exactly. There's been a huge shift from treatment practices, which are really all about insight, to the realization that sometimes insight doesn't change anything and doesn't amount to a hill of beans, but rather, especially traumatic experiences, live in our bodies. Bessel's new book is called The Body Keeps the Score, as you probably know. And so what we really need are direct physiological interventions. And that's what especially the yoga tradition has in spades: direct intervention into the body, into the nervous system, into the vagus nerve. So that we've done a bunch of studies with military folks who are suffering from trauma, and yoga has been very effective in diving deep into the body and unwinding some of those knots. And that's what you'll find in your interviews, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by all of it. And it also gives people some very applicable tools that they also can start to do on their own after too. It's not something that's dependent on having a practitioner. It might be initially to guide them, but then ultimately there's home care. It's all of it's within their own capacity to almost regulate once you can move through certain parts of it.
I think about another great Freud quote. Freud said, psychoanalysis is to relieve the patient from neurotic misery so that he can return to ordinary suffering. Psychoanalysis is to relieve the patient of neurotic suffering so he can return to ordinary suffering. And a lot of the contemplative traditions are precisely about ordinary suffering. Not so much neurotic suffering, but the suffering of everyday life.
Yeah, well, and that makes me think of the Buddha's concept of the two arrows. So the ordinary suffering is just that first arrow that's just a part of living in this world. And it seems like the second arrow is more the suffering that we create and shoot ourselves with over and over again from the storyline and the not being able to release the emotions and all of the other pieces that build it up around that.
So we call that pain and the pain of pain. Pain is inevitable. Suffering in these traditions is usually seen as the pain of pain. That is, the whole story and the reactivity that we weave around what is truly painful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the part that's the epidemic now, I think.
So much so. People are so into their stories and their elaborate the elaborate stories that we weave about what's actually a very simple phenomenon of pain and defensiveness in the body. And these practices go right into the body, so that there's the development of what in yoga is called the witness consciousness, which is simply the capacity to begin directly apprehending and connecting with those defenses and those knots and that suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really all that meditation and yoga are about, is the systematic development of awareness of those highly patterned forms of suffering that each of us have. And the miracle is that the act of simply becoming aware of those patterns is itself very freeing. So I began to notice this. We at Kripalu, we developed a whole relationship with Bikram. Not sure if you know who Bikram is, but
Mm-hmm.
an Indian yoga teacher. And so he's got a very intensive practice that runs you through 26 postures in 110-degree heat. And I remember I spent 6 years studying that practice, 6 days a week, intensive Bikram yoga, 6 days a week. He had come to Kripalu, by the way, and built us a whole Bikram studio, and he
Oh,
and his
wow.
wife teach. But I remember as I got deeper and deeper into those 6 years, beginning to experience awareness of the energy patterns in my body as if it were one of those acupuncture charts that you see on the
Yep.
wall, all lit up. And it began to become so real. Wow, those are the patterns. And just actually seeing that began to soften them, in a wonderful way.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. Just the awareness of it allowed it to start to shift inside.
exactly.
Yeah.
Touching it with your awareness begins to soften it. And that's there are three classic afflicted states that are the same in both Buddhism and yoga: grasping, aversion, and delusion. And especially with grasping and aversion, the instruction is always the same. The first instruction is feel it in your body, become aware of it. You're caught up in a state of grasping and craving and clinging. Stop for a minute and investigate it. Well, okay, where is it in the body? And I remember the first time I did this, I was at a long meditation retreat, and the instructor had said, look, when you notice that a state of grasping arises, a state of greed, just stop for a minute and examine it in your body. And I was on one of those retreats where they kind of only have aduki beans and rice for lunch, and one day there was blueberry cobbler or something at the end of the line, and I realized that I wasn't going to get the blueberry cobbler because there were only 5 people. There were 10 people in front of me and only 5 pieces left. So I thought, okay, I'll try that. What's this like in my body right now, this state of grasping? And to my amazement, that state of grasping turns out to be very uncomfortable, very painful. I could feel this sense of tightness around here and like my jaw, and it was like my tongue was hanging out like a dog on a hot day. So the investigation, the direct visceral investigation of these difficult so-called afflicted states is itself pretty much the solution, which is cool because it's not that complicated.
I think that's part of the problem sometimes for people, is that it seems too simple, and we're almost conditioned that it needs to be something more dramatic or harder work to do or something along those lines to deliver such value. But that's what
Absolutely.
I love about so many of
Yeah,
the teachings, is I find them very simple teachings. It's just a matter of and they're very experiential. You have to just do them until you gain
that's
the
right.
experience like you had, and then you get these insights around it once that happens.
Well, this is one of the things, that drives Eastern teachers crazy when they come over from Burma or wherever, India, and they find that American students we're way up in our heads and we're all about insight. and we're really working it hard up there.
Mhm.
And the instruction is always, no, 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 just come back to the breath, come back to the body, come back to the sensations. Um, Joseph Goldstein, great Buddhist teacher, has a wonderful story about an interview he was doing. And this guy comes in and says, I have this pain in my jaw. And then he went off on this huge story about the pain in his jaw. And it probably went back to his mother and bottle feeding rather than nipple feeding. And Joseph said, okay, you have a pain in your jaw. And then the guy went off on the story again. And he's like, you have a pain in your jaw. So yeah, it's coming back over and over again. And, look, I've been meditating for 30 years and I'm a pretty accomplished meditator. I love meditation. I do it. It's like my church. But even so, there are many sits where the whole practice is just coming back again and again to the breath. Ordinarily, for me, it usually does settle down and I go deeper and deeper and deeper. But, for most of us, a lot of the practice is just softly bring it back, bring it back. And that's where a lot of the effort really has to go. And so a lot of students make it much more difficult and complicated, just as you said. Yeah.
Yeah, but ultimately just such simple teachings, but with a lot of payback if you can do them. Stephen, I wanted to ask you a little bit too about from the great works of your life and the concept of your true calling, as far as what does that actually mean, and how does one know if they're actually following their true calling or not?
Yeah. So, it's so interesting, Jason. People have really found themselves compelled by this whole idea of Dharma. In the yoga tradition, it was believed that everyone had a Dharma, which is usually translated to mean sacred duty or true calling or life purpose. It was easier back in the day when the Gita was written because you were actually born into your true calling. So either you were a priest or a farmer or a
Mm.
tradesman, you were born into it. And that was called Svadharma, your own Dharma. That was a culture that didn't so much have a sense of the individual self. The individual self was inhered in this social structure. Now we have the idea of this wonderful individual subjective self. And so Svadharma now has moved to something slightly different. It's Svabhava, which means your own true nature. And the way you get to that are every human being has his or her own idiosyncratic combination of gifts. And that's an investigation of your gifts usually is what leads you to an understanding of your purpose, your calling, what you're meant to be doing. This is called Dharma, and we know that your dharmas can change over time. There's not necessarily just one dharma. Sometimes people have multiple dharmas. I've found, as I wrote in the book, that very often there's something I call the romance of dharma. People have this idea that, in order to find your dharma, you have to leave your job selling insurance and go to Paris and paint. But the truth is, most of us have already mucked around pretty close to our dharma at some point in our life. And more than anything, the process of identifying your dharma is focusing, is getting crystal clear on, okay, what is your idiosyncratic gift and calling, and what's the opportunity of your life right now that pretty much nobody else has. It's identifying that and getting really clear about it and speaking it and then acting on it. So we're not so used to that idea in this culture, but in the Indian culture from which this particular treatise that I've written on is is born, the idea that everybody has a sacred calling is pretty well accepted.
Hmm. Well, I think that's even in, gosh, even in Montessori schools, I think that was Maria Montessori used to talk about children
Mm,
all have a cosmic purpose, right?
yeah,
So I think of that as almost the same
yeah.
idea.
What I end up working with people a lot around Dharma, and it's mostly, in my book, I laid out what I call the 4 pillars of Dharma, which is identify your Dharma, do it full out. That is to say, bring everything you've got to it. That's called the doctrine of unified action. The third pillar is let go of the fruits. That is, let go of the outcome. Krishna says to Arjuna, it's better to fail at your own Dharma than to succeed at the Dharma of another.
Mhm.
And then finally, turn it over to God or to something bigger than yourself. But in truth, I spend most of my time working with people around identifying their dharmas. Because once you got it, like you've clearly got your dharma, you're into it, I can feel it. Once you've got it, the next 3 pillars roll out pretty easily. Do it full out. Well, yeah, you're going to do it full out. Krishna says, this is the passion that is not contrary to the dharma. You bring all your passion to it. And then let go of the fruit. Okay, that's a challenge, but we can talk about that. And then turn it over to God. Those kind of roll out. But the question of, well, I don't have any sense of what I don't have any life. I don't think I have a vocation. I get that a lot.
Mhm.
So I actually give people what I call 3 very productive hunting grounds for Dharma. And I don't think I didn't write about this in the book, but there are 3 different areas that are really useful to look at. Number 1, what lights you up? This is a very visceral thing, okay? And I have people make a list in a workshop of what's lighting me up right now. And it can be anything from the most mundane thing, like I'm watching a British murder mystery right now, and it's really lighting me up because it's really well done, and chocolate lights me up. But there's also a list of serious stuff in there, writing and stuff.
Yeah.
Um, so the very first thing to look at is what's really lighting you up. And I tell people, hey, don't censor that list. If, I happen to be lit up by the British royal family, so I put that on my list. All kinds of funky things light us up. But that's where you start, what lights you up. Then there's a second great hunting ground, which is more the question of duty, which is different from what lights you up. Because sometimes we don't actually feel so lit up so often about our duty. Duty, in this case, I define as that thing which, if you do not do it, you will feel a profound sense of self-betrayal. The thing which, if you do not do it or achieve it in your life, you will feel a profound sense of self-betrayal. What that does is it shifts the source of duty from the exterior, like something somebody's putting on you, to the interior. I have certain duties in my life. I have duties to people whom I love. I have duties to Kripalu. I sometimes play different administrative roles there. I founded the institute there. That doesn't always light me up, but it's a duty. There's in duty, there is this deeper kind of ardency, this deeper kind of fulfillment. So what lights you up? What's your duty? And then the third hunting ground I use is, are you facing a deep challenge of some kind right now? It could be a health challenge. It could be that breakup that you and I talked about
Mhm.
earlier. Very often, that challenge itself can be seen as a dharma, something that you take on as your primary um, source of investment in the moment. I write, for example, about Marianne Woodman, the great Jungian analyst, who got bone cancer. She closed her psychoanalytic practice and she said, hey, this is my dharma. I'm taking on bone cancer now. Now, that may not be everybody's approach to cancer at all, but that was hers. So what's lighting you up? What's your duty as you deeply feel it? And is there a challenge right now that's your dharmic pursuit at this point? So
Mhm.
early on in the stage of working with people around Dharma, they need help uh, identifying it.
I love that breakdown of those three. That's really, really helpful. One question I have around it is sometimes I find with duty and obligation sometimes
Yeah,
become really intermixed and hard to pull
right,
apart for people. How do you know when something is a deeper sense of duty versus when it almost is more of like an obligation that might create almost guilt or shame if you're not doing it, but that's not necessarily a healthy
right.
version?
And almost all of us have that, by the way. Almost all of us have in the past or are now experiencing some obligation that's really been foisted on us and is not an obligation that we ourselves have really taken on. So I found that it's a fairly long-term project to tease those things apart. Okay.
Hmm.
Um, for example, I my dharma is really writing. Why? How do I know? It lights me up so much. It gives me a sense of intrinsic fulfillment. I I sit here day after day, and I don't have a great day every day. I just finished a new chapter, and it was hard. It was hard to get it going. But there is this deep, profound sense of intrinsic fulfillment with it. Um, at the same time, there are obligations that go with being an author. I have to get out and speak. Sometimes I have to do book signings. There's a whole financial part of it that I have to do with my agent and stuff. That stuff doesn't light me up, but it's a duty that I have to my Dharma. That's an obligation and a duty that I have to my central Dharma. And
Hmm.
so I don't resent it. I don't really usually resent most of that stuff. If you find yourself really resenting an obligation, then you really need to do some inner work about, or is this been foisted on you, or is this maybe something that you actually have to accept and own? Oh, this goes along with my dharma.
Hmm.
So very often you get this with parents. There's a certain point where it's really tough being a parent, and oh man, those kids are just an albatross around my neck. If I didn't have kids, I could be painting in Paris, right? So that's a question of going back deep inside. At some point, you chose those kids as your dharma, and there's a duty there that most likely you're going to have to own again, at least for a while.
Hmm.
So it's tricky pulling those things apart, but I know exactly what you mean. Obligation. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a really all of that's really helpful. As it also makes me reminds us that just being on path with your dharma doesn't mean that everything's rainbows and butterflies all the time either. Where sometimes I think there's this a little bit of a delusion that once you get on path,
No.
everything is perfect, and ultimately that wouldn't really make sense anyways, because then there's nothing really to kind of keep growing and evolving and.
Yeah. So that's good because that's another part of what I call the romance of dharma. This false notion. It's a very sentimental notion, and the definition of sentimentality is the sentimental mind only wants to look at one part of reality, like it wants to look only at the sweet and not the sour. But for me, it's the showing up every day to write. And some days it's difficult and some days it's not. But and some days I'm not even happy about it. And this is where there's an important distinction between happiness and fulfillment. Happiness is a mind state that comes and goes. There's no such thing as permanent ethereal happiness. Fulfillment is more of a is a more enduring state that lives beneath happiness. You can have a profound sense of fulfillment, as I do in writing, and not be happy about it every day. So those are two really important things to tease apart.
Mhm.
Fulfillment, if you know what it tastes like. You do a great podcast or a great interview and it rises up. Fulfillment
Mhm.
rises up and it feeds you. And that's a wonderful thing.
That's almost, I think, a big distinction between it. To me, I feel like fulfillment is something that more rises up from within as opposed to
Yeah.
something from the outside that is more temporarily needs to have that experience to feel the happiness versus something that is more innate that surfaces from inside.
Yeah. Um, Robert Frost said something like, happiness is moving comfortably in harness, which I love. You know, he used all those agricultural metaphors,
Hmm.
but the horse is moving comfortably in harness and plowing the field. And so you move comfortably in harness. You choose the harness. We're lucky we get to choose the harness. I mean, you and I and most of the people listening to this are very privileged that we're even talking about Dharma.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
One question about the first part of that Dharma, I would say that's probably when you were talking about what lights you up, that's definitely one that I connect with from my process anyways. And for me, that feeling would be how I would term inspired. I would feel this full body inspiration feeling. I'd
Yeah.
get goosebumps literally, and that would be a sign for me that that's an important part of my path, whatever it is.
Right.
And I think before I would just kind of let it come and go on its own time. And now when it does happen, I take it more as something that's important to pay attention to. If something really lights me up, let me kind of explore that a little bit more and see where that takes me. So,
That's such a good point, Jason. Um, I just want to underline that because very often those moments of inspiration and really joy
mhm,
in response to what we're doing are fleeting. And it's kind of important to stop and notice them and savor them a little bit, swim in them a little bit.
mhm,
My friend whose name I'm blocking out, who wrote The Buddha's Brain, I'll get it. Anyway, um, he shows the way in which the brain is actually subtly changed when we take time to savor joyful moments. And so I just want to encourage people to do that. You know, I go to Whole Foods almost every day to pick up my lunch, and there's a whole flower stand at the beginning. So as you walk in, there's a whole display of flowers. And I've made it a point to stop and literally smell the flowers and just take that little moment of savoring and enjoying. So it's good to do that with your Dharma.
mhm. Well, one of my questions around that is that, so for me, that was a very visceral feeling that I got to know and understand that it meant more to me and it was important to pay attention to. I generally find that as a populace, a lot of us are really disconnected from what we feel. Like it's almost like the feeling state for a chunk of time, especially in the West, really was not valued very much, especially not in comparison to the intellect. And a lot of times I think it's very easy to feel something and then either rationalize our way out of it, or maybe the feeling was discredited, so even that it meant something for us, we kind of pushed it away. So in a lot of ways I think we've almost become disconnected to that feeling. So how do we even begin that process to start to reconnect again to that feeling that is so important as a guide?
Totally. This is where the Buddhists here would talk about the four factors of mindfulness. And the very first thing that practice in all the traditions does is to point you to the body and breath. That's where you begin. So in order to get to feelings, you have to go through the doorway of actually feeling sensation in your body and feeling the breath. The second thing is Vedana, or feelings. This is more subtle. So once you actually connect with the reality of the body, and believe me, most beginning meditators don't really meditate. They just begin to get used to the utter strangeness of being in the body and feeling all those sensations. So the body and breath is number one. Vedana, or feelings, is number two. The third one, the more subtle, is of course cognitive, or thoughts. And then the fourth is Dharma, or consciousness itself. So I love the traditions because they point you to increasingly subtle levels of knowing of the body and breath, feelings, mental states, consciousness itself.
Mm-hmm.
It's very systematic. It's a training, really. And as such, it's a training almost everybody can do.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, and it's actually reflects so much in medicine. I'm a naturopathic doctor and an osteopath, and how we look at it is there's sort of these five bodies to healing, very
Yeah.
similar to the koshas. And it
Yep.
would be this physical body, this vital, energetic body, this mental body where we attribute meaning to things, this sort of wisdom or intellect body where you connect to these bigger, almost more like these archetypes that like Socrates would have talked about and whatnot. And then this bliss body, which is more this deeper connection to a feeling of connection, inner connection to source, or
Right.
consciousness as its whole. So I think it's just so valuable to have. This is partly what I love about the yoga tradition, is so many of these things are just talked about as it's just all part of this big picture. There's no real separation. They're all these different pieces, and there's a bit of a roadmap on moving through them.
Yeah. Well, in the yoga tradition, for example, the the mind and body are seen as the same thing. So the mind is the subtle body, the body is the gross mind. There's no real distinction made between those. They're just various levels of subtlety.
Hmm.
So you know, this whole separation between those domains that we have is completely artificial in the contemplative traditions. And the point that you make is so good. If you're not in touch with how joy feels in the body, or how fulfillment feels in the body, then you're probably going to miss it when it actually arises.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Couple other questions. I want to be respectful of your time here too. I know in your book, especially the one that I read, The Great Works of Your Life that I was gifted, and lots of stories. You would incorporate different stories from different people. What do you
Yeah.
find the value for that in assisting others in also finding their true calling as well?
Um, you probably notice that in that particular book, and now in a lot of my books, I'm using great lives, um, and ordinary lives. And the reason I did it initially was, first of all, those great lives are very inspiring. So I start with Jane Goodall, for example, and then there's a really inspiring life.
Hmm.
Uh, and then I tell a story of an ordinary priest. And I find that that those two stories, as they interact, create something that's more than the sum of their parts. You're basically telling the same story in two ways. Like in that particular chapter is about the gift, is about giftedness. And I've found that people really get lit up and inspired by the great lives, Robert Frost, Walt Whitman, etc. They get inspired by those, but it's also a kind of a writing trick to reinforce the story. So right now I'm writing a new book about Dharma, and today I'm working on a chapter on Marian Anderson, who was the great black contralto, of course. And I'm also using a story of a soprano who I worked with at Tanglewood Music Center one summer. And so I use those two stories because they kind of ricochet off each other. And the ordinary story says, hey, that's an ordinary person. I could probably do that. And the extraordinary story says, wow, that's something to aspire to.
Hmm.
So there's that. And then there's the fact that I have just gotten so lit up reading these stories about these people. Now I'm right now reading all about Marian Anderson. I'm listening to her music. I'm saturating myself in this gorgeous Black woman, her soul, which she puts out there so beautifully. And so it's fun for me. I guess I'd say that too. It's
Yeah,
fun.
I really like it too. I know a book I wrote about 10 years ago with a close friend of mine called Letters That Move the World, Intentional Acts of Gratitude. And it was a bit of a process on eventually creating more of a global shift in consciousness would sort of be the outcome of what we would like to do with it. But one of the sections is on what we call heroes. And
Yeah,
that's stories of other people's journeys. And so HERO was an acronym for how experiences reflect on others. And
beautiful.
so that idea is, I always find people really like that section a lot because it's personal. They're just regular people, but all heroes in their own way of how they have either moved through challenges or adversity. And it just sort of sets this feeling of inspiration and courage and all of the things we want to muster that usually get in our way to do those
Yeah,
things for ourselves. And I really appreciate that in your book too, because I always find when I'm reading stories of other people and even researching the book, I'd be reading the biographies of Mother Teresa and Martin Luther King and some of these different people that just, these archetypes almost that create this sensation inside your body to then step into your
exactly.
own.
And those stories also make the points that you're trying to make in the chapter. It makes them stick more.
Mhm.
So like the story about Jane Goodall and her gifts, that scene where she spends a whole day in the chicken coop watching the chicken hatch the egg when she's 3 years old, it makes the story about giftedness really stick. And it's also like, these are people we should know. We should know about her. We should know about Frost and Whitman and Emerson. And there's certain great lives that we kind of have a little bit of a duty to know about. Yeah.
Well, I remember growing up, and my parents had this, I can't remember the name of them now, but it was a group of books, and it was basically like virtues. And it was a
Wow.
story of a person for
Yeah.
that virtue. And it was from all over the world. Like I remember one on ingenuity, and it was about the Wright brothers. And there was, so it was like they basically took a virtue, and then it was a life story that connected to that virtue. And oh gosh, I so wish I had those for my little kids now. But
Yeah.
yeah, it was a whole volume, and it was just depend on what you wanted to learn about. But it was all from a story rather than just sort of saying, here's what it means to be
Yeah.
this. Here's what it means to be that. You get a visceral sensation for it by reading about it and connecting to the
That's great.
story.
Yeah. And the Wright brothers, what a great story of
Yeah,
ingenuity and breakthrough. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
I love that. You're gonna have to find that
I
and
was just thinking, I'm gonna call my mom later and find out what the names of those books are. They got to be somewhere on eBay or something. So Stephen, you had mentioned gifts, and one thing that you had written before, you said that you have a responsibility to your gifts. I'm wondering if you can break that down a little bit.
Yeah. Annie Dillard, great American writer whom I love, says, and for writers, she says, look, if you've ever eaten a hamburger or ridden on a jet plane, don't tell me about it. Tell me about what only you love. Tell me about what you see, because we all see the world in a slightly different way. And that seeing is a gift for all of us. Now, there's some confusion about the question of gift. Does it mean gifted? No, not necessarily. Not all of us are gifted, but the the love that you have for some some pastime or some piece of work, the love that you have, the longing, the way in which you're compelled by it, that in itself is a gift. So I told you my first career was in dance, and I was a student at Jacob's Pillow, which is a big dance festival here. And there was a lovely guy who was there as a dance student with me, and he was a kind of skinny white kid from the Bronx. And Alvin Ailey's company came, and his longing in life, his goal was to join the Alvin Ailey Dance Company. Well, it's a dance company of black dancers. This was a skinny white kid from the Bronx, and he wasn't a good dancer either. But the whole idea was his gift was the love for that form. And his challenge in life was to make some kind of connection with it. Whether he got in the company, I don't really know. We were only 21 years old then. But there's an example of how the love, the attraction toward the that particular domain is itself the gift. You don't have to be gifted in order to find that in your life.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree with you more. And I feel like that is such an important thing. And it's always an important thing, but I feel like even more so now in where the world is, and when we hit these big periods of transition that open up a bit more of a space for deep reflection around things, my fundamental belief is that the more people that do connect to their gifts,
Right.
that ultimately creates certain shifts inside you anyways, and then that's the stuff that eventually ripples out to your friends, your family, your community, and eventually those are the kind of things that create global shifts anyways. It's not going to come from up here down. It starts from just individuals connecting to what that is, because when you connect to that, it's like Irvin Laszlo talked about in his book, the reconnection to source, or connection to source. He talked about the importance of a spiritual experience. I almost feel like really connecting deeply to your gift is in a lot of ways a spiritual experience, because I feel like that's part of where the gift comes from. And when we have those
Absolutely.
experiences, you just all of a sudden things change. You have perspectives that magically show up in ways that you just could not have planned in your head. And so those types of things, and why that's such an important place to connect to, that is what creates shifts. That's what creates the next sort of shifts in your world, which ultimately spread out to the rest of the world.
I love that. I love what you just said, Jason. It's um, there's an inner knowing about what aspect of the world fascinates you and draws you. And to the extent that you can make that connection with whatever it is that fascinates you, and there's a lid for every pot. There's something that fascinates everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And it's your duty, this is where duty comes in, to give that gift back to the world. It was Carol Pearson, the great Jungian analyst, who wrote that phrase, your duty to your gift. And, you know, a complicated part of that for many people is the world does not always see that or value that. You still have the same duty to the gift. So I've written, I'm on my 6th book now. Not every book has been a screaming success. One book dropped off the edge of the planet, but it was a book of essays that I invited a lot of my Buddhist and yogi friends to do with me. It was a great book. I still feel like it was important to do. The fact that the world didn't see it, as Krishna says, not my problem. It's better to fail at your own Dharma than to succeed at the Dharma of another. The question is always, are you doing your Dharma? And are you doing it full out and bringing all the passion that you have to it?
Yeah, it makes me think Mother Teresa used to say, "Do good anyways," right? I feel like
Anyway, yeah,
that's the idea behind it. So, but I think still it puts it out somewhere, right? It
it
would have
does.
created some kind of a shift in you, which
That's right.
it goes out from there.
That's the thing about Dharma, Jason. It has a mystic effect on the world. That is to say, an effect that isn't measured by how we ordinarily measure effect in the world. It's mystical, but it
Mhm.
has an effect in the world, and you have to trust that. The Buddha said, one human being who transforms their life, becomes enlightened essentially, transforms 7 generations of their family going forward and 7 generations going back.
Mhm.
So that we act of waking up changes the world in ways we can't really even imagine.
Yeah, I love that thought. And when we think about it like that too, there's a different layer of self-responsibility a little bit.
Yeah,
And I don't mean responsibility in an obligatory way, but just this inner sense of self-responsibility, self-accountability for
right.
what is important for us, and that it is important when we get driven by something and get inspired by something. But it's also like it's why patience and faith, I think, is so important. It's patience and faith because you really don't know until you may never know, or you may not know until a long
It's,
time down the road.
you know, Emily Dickinson changed the world. And yeah, Emily Dickinson's a great example of someone who intuited her Dharma. She had a Dharma for writing poetry. You know, she went to her room every day and pulled the blinds, got quiet, really went into meditation, and then allowed the poetry to be channeled through her. And it was widely seen as pretty bad poetry in those days. She used her own idiosyncratic voice, her own idiosyncratic use of punctuation and poetic line. And during her lifetime, there was never more than one of her poems published under her name. She did not get the mirroring of the world that we all want. We'd all like that for our Dharma. I'd like every book that I write, I'd like the world to see it and love it as much as I do. It doesn't happen that way. So it takes a leap of faith, to use your term, a leap of faith to stay connected to your own idiosyncratic voice and to really believe that your own voice matters in exactly the way that you say and do things in accordance with your Dharma. And because we ever only see a small part of the tapestry of its effect, we often don't understand the profoundly mystical effect of actions taken in service of the Dharma. Actions taken in service of the Dharma have a mystical impact on the world. I'm writing right now, or will be soon, on Therese de Lisieux, one of the great Catholic saints, who lived a teeny little life in her monastery in southern France. And as a result of the impeccable way in which she lived that life, she's called the Little Flower, she wrote about the way she lived her life, and it's literally changed the world. So that little book that she wrote about her life, The Story of a Soul, it's called, she's become one of the very few female doctors of the Catholic Church. So there's Therese of Avila and there's Therese de Lisieux. It's another example. It's another Dickinsonian type example of somebody who was just living their Dharma fully and who changed the world. Never knew it. She didn't know it. She died young. Emily Dickinson died at 57. But yeah, mystic effect.
Yeah, you just don't know where your drop is going to ripple out to in
You
that
don't.
ocean.
You don't. And every now and then it'll come back to you in really sweet ways, which I'm sure you've discovered that you don't expect. And I love that. I love that. But you don't expect it.
Hmm. There's bonuses. Help you kind of
Bonus.
stay on path, I think.
Exactly. Every now and then the universe sends you a bonus that's it's just so delightful. One of my bonuses recently was I went to college at Amherst College, which was an all men's school, a very elite school in Western Massachusetts. And I was a scared little dude from the Midwest. All these boys who'd been to fancy prep schools, and I came off, the farm. And I've forgotten why I'm telling that story now. Sorry.
That's okay.
I got disturbed by a noise in the hall there. Um, it doesn't matter. I've forgotten the point of that story, Jason. You
I was
can
trying to
edit.
think, where were we? Yeah, I'll edit it out. But what were we talking about just before that?
Doesn't matter.
Hmm.
Emily Dickinson. But
If it pops back up, feel free to jump in and we'll throw it in. One last question I've got for you before we go here, but you've mentioned about
just,
the importance
just
of.
pop,
Sorry, go ahead.
it just popped back up. I realized what I was trying to say.
Go ahead.
So we were talking about gifts from the universe, and I was saying that I was a student at Amherst, and I was very much in awe of my English professor, Kim Townsend, Robert Townsend. He's a brilliant guy. Um, Now is 84 years of age, lives up in Maine, runs a candy store up in Maine. And recently I decided I was going to make a point of reconnecting with people who had real impact on my life and let them know that they have. He was my writing teacher who inspired me, and I never told him. And he was only 26 in those days. He was this incredibly handsome Armenian man who was charismatic, and I had a little crush on him. And I wrote him and I said, "Hey, Kim Townsend, you changed my life, dude. You don't know it, but I adore you." And I sent him the books that I'd written, and we've now been having this romance for the last couple of years. And it's just one of those little gifties that you get. Oh my God, Kim Townsend, he loves my writing. I love him. I love his writing. I've gotten to know his wife. And I wrote him the other day about the plague years and just checked in with him. And I said, you bring joy to my life. And that's a huge gift. So that was the story I wanted to tell.
I love that. It's so funny, Stephen. The reason that we ended up writing that book, The Letters That Move the World, was when I was in my second year at naturopathic medicine. I was just sitting there reflecting on how did I end up where I was? Just one of those, you just start going through all the people, the situations, and what started to come up was the people that really influenced my life and made such an impact on me. And there's lots of people, but it came down to sort of two that really stood out with me. And one of them was my grandmother, who was this real, just this, sometimes you can have this real beautiful relationship with grandparents because they're step
Yeah.
away from the disciplinary part. And she was very much just this, I was so blessed to have this concept of what real unconditional love felt like. And the other person was my karate instructor that I started karate when I was really young. And we had this whole, and it was not just my karate instructor, but it was the family that he created, that so
Hmm.
many people within that family that I could almost not picture how I would even be where I was without the influence from so many people within that dynamic. But I was so overwhelmed by the feeling of appreciation that I wrote letters to them to tell them, like I couldn't keep it in anymore. And what was really
Fabulous.
fascinating
Yeah.
was when I wrote the book, it was about
Huh.
10 years after those letters. And I remember going back and visiting my grandma, and she was at a home for a little while there. And I stayed with her for a few days, and I was reading her the book, and I was telling her how much of an influence she was in writing the book. And she goes to her
Yeah.
dresser, opens it up, and pulls out the letter that I had given her, sent to her 10 years ago. And she said, I read this letter
My
every
God.
night before bed. And she pulled out a couple of other cards from my mom and my sister, my brother, that she had received over different times for things. And she said every
Yeah.
night she reads that and it just fills her heart up. And like I get
Oh,
goosebumps thinking about it
Jason.
because it
Yeah.
reminded me of just how a simple act of sharing something from your heart can just make ripples over years of impact on somebody else's life that you just wouldn't know. And I mean, so it's like that sort of thing just makes me think how important it is to act on some of those things when you can connect to it. Just like, you got that sensation, you connected,
Yeah.
and look at how much more joy got expanded into your life from just being able to act on that impulse.
My new friend Kim was just beyond delighted because it turns out that you're going along doing your Dharma. Most people don't tell you how much impact you've had on them.
Mhm.
And so I was a gift to him and he was a gift to me. And
Yeah.
I love your story. What's the name of your letters book? I got to get that.
It's called Letters That Move the World: Intentional Acts of Gratitude. Yeah, it's on my website. You can check it out there. But we're actually in the process, given everything that's going on right now, my
Yeah.
friend and I are actually in the process of kind of revamping some stuff a little bit and try to put it out, because I feel like right now there's this, as much as there's a lot of fear and uncertainty, the world collectively is interconnected in a stronger way than I think it ever has been. And if we can connect that a little bit more through appreciation, I think there's a really nice opportunity for a different way of connecting right at the moment too.
Let me just say, I love that idea for a book. That's a beautiful idea, Jason.
Oh,
Young
thanks very much.
letters that move the world. Did you use Rilke's letter to a young poet?
No, but that would have
No,
been, yeah, that
that
would
was
have
an
been,
excellent. Yeah,
yeah, I think you'll find it interesting. I mean, it was sort of like we just broke it down into different pieces to get people eventually to a place where they're ready to write the letters. And then the
yeah,
objective would be that also
beautiful.
then there is a global release of the letters over the same period of time. So there'd be this idea of these letters going all over the world within a 24-hour period of people giving and
Yeah.
receiving these things over the span of like a week or
Uh,
so. Although now with emails, it's
oh my,
you could do it. So that's kind of partly what we're working on right now.
yeah.
But yeah, but that was sort of an aside. It just reminded me when you were talking about it, I was like, oh my gosh, that was so much like my experience with it. But my last question I
That's
wanted
great.
to ask you was the importance of spiritual friendships and community. I know one of my old mentors,
Mm,
Dr. David Hawkins, he wrote a really revolutionary book called Power versus Force back in the day. And he used to talk a
yeah,
lot about the importance of spiritual community. And I know that you've mentioned that before as well, and the importance of that. Can you just outline that a little bit?
absolutely. My most recent book is called Soul Friends, and it's really an attempt to dive into that territory, because it turns out that we are creatures that are profoundly co-created through our deepest relationships and our deepest friendships. And I wanted to investigate, I wanted to create more distinctions around that. So I turned to the work of Heinz Kohut, who was, of course, a disciple of Freud. And Heinz Kohut's basic idea was that it is, in order to be a fully alive human being, in order to thrive in this world, you have to create around you what he called a surround of relationships that are evoking, sustaining, and affirming. Evoking, evoking your best self, sustaining, and affirming. And he also articulated 6 or 7 different kinds of friendships that were necessary for that, what he called and what I call the fully alive human being. So there's the container, that is the person with whom you feel and whose arms you feel safely held and soothed. Now, that was probably your grandmother
Hmm.
for you. It was my grandmother for me. And the first chapter of my book, Soul Friends, is about my grandmother, because she created that safe psychic space within which I could come alive, really. And so that's so containment. The second one is what Kohut calls twinship. And twinship is really that creature that we call best friends, you know, best friends forever, or the bromance that you had in 12th grade
Mhm.
or whatever. And these are people with whom we feel a deep, profound, not quite romantic, but almost romantic kind of uh, a live connection. Very often we have 1 or 2 of these in adolescence, and throughout adult life we may have 1 or more. Then I look at the adversary. So it turns out that in order to be our best selves, all of us need some kind of deep adversarial, a deep sustaining adversarial relationship where that person doesn't just mirror back to us all of our great stuff, but actually pushes against us in a sustained but loving way. And the mirror, of course, is another one. The mirror is the person who, for whatever reason, and this is another mystical thing, every now and then in life, there's somebody who gets you. There's somebody who sees you and gets you. I feel like I get you, by the way, and it's a wonderful thing. Like I already like you, and I get you, and it doesn't all happen always or even all that often, but the mirror is somebody who gets you and who mirrors you back to yourself in very specific ways. Um, then there's something I call the mystic friend. And the mystic friend is someone with whom we have a mystic connection across space and time. So when I first read, for example, the work of called The Cloud of Unknowing, which is by a 14th century English mystic, it's like that book was written for me. I read that every day on the way to graduate school and back in Boston. There are other mystic friends that I've had, like Freud and Cohood and Annie Dillard, my favorite American writer. These are friendships that where you don't actually know the person. Beethoven had this kind of mystic friendship with Bach. Bach was long dead when Beethoven was alive, but in Bach he saw the full flower of who he could be. You know, he started looking at Bach's fugues, and he was blown away by the music, and it was a mirror for him to see who he could be in his own genius. So that's the mystic friend. And then finally, what I call the conscious partner. So this is somebody, if we're lucky, we have right now. I live with my friend Susie, and she and I are conscious partners. And that's the partner as an adult with whom you're deeply connected, but also share a common commitment to being everything you can be. So that's the partner who maybe you live with and maybe pushes you and mirrors you and does kind of all of the above. I fully believe that we're co-created beings, and that every one of us has 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 people we could easily name with whom we've been in deep, deep connection. And maybe you only knew them for a month and had a wild, passionate affair, but they changed you in some way. So yeah, that's my latest book. I really dove into that topic deeply.
Yeah, I haven't read that one yet, but I love that breakdown. And I totally think of that mystic connection as being a part of almost this soul group, that you have
Yeah,
certain things that you've almost signed up before even coming here
exactly.
to work on, and you can almost borrow from each other's
I,
brilliance a little bit.
yeah, that's how I felt about Thoreau when I started reading Thoreau. And then it turns out Thoreau has this whole soul group thing that you're talking about, where Annie Dillard, my favorite writer, is also a kind of disciple of Freud. And her husband, Robert Richardson, who wrote the great biography of Thoreau. So yeah, by the way, read the first chapter of that book, because it's about grandmas. So you'll
I'm
identify.
gonna send you the letter that I wrote, just the first part around that sort of
Yeah,
spurred on the reason to write the book. I'll email it to you after, if I can find it somewhere on my computer at this point, because that was
okay,
a long time back, but it'll be there somewhere. And I'll
thank
send
you.
you a copy of the book. Yeah,
Okay, and I'm
I'll
going to send
send.
you a copy of Soul Friends, so don't buy it. I'll send you and I'll sign it. Yeah.
Perfect. So we'll exchange addresses thereafter. But Stephen, what an absolute pleasure. So wonderful getting to talk to you. I was really looking forward to speaking with you. I felt like I was going to really enjoy our conversation just from reading your works and watching some
Good.
of the stuff that
Thanks.
you've done.
And
We'll make
ditto.
sure that
Ditto.
we come and say hi next time my wife and I are at Kripalu, for
Yeah,
sure.
give me a heads up before you come so we can make sure to connect.
Absolutely. Stephen, where is the best place to send people to learn more about all of the work that you're doing? I know you run retreats sometimes, you've got some different courses, you've got lots of books. Where's the best
Right.
place to send people to learn more?
Best place is my own website, which is www.stephencope.com. And that's STEPHENCOPE together.com. Yeah.
Okay,
You can also go to the Kripalu website and just write my name in, and it'll give you tons of stuff about me and my articles and the courses that I'm leading there at Kripalu.
wonderful. I will make sure I have all those links in the show notes when everything goes out. Stephen, thank you
Okay.
so much.
Jason, what a pleasure. We'll talk more.
Absolutely. That was great.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and wonderful chatting with you. That was total soul food for
Likewise.
me too. So
Good. I'll send you my address and the links and stuff like that.
Perfect. I'll send you mine as well. So, okay,
Thanks,
Stephen,
Jason.
take care and good luck with the rest of your stuff on your book. And I look forward to touching base again sometime in the future.
Yeah, this is just the beginning. Thanks, buddy.
Yeah,
Okay,
you bet. Take
bye
care.
now.
Well, that was awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to invest in your health and well-being. Since this podcast is brand new, reviews and subscribers are so vital for us to get off the ground and share this really important information. So if you found this information valuable, please post a review and subscribe to the podcast so you'll get our newest episodes. Also, if you know of someone who would benefit from this, please share it with them. You can also find us on Instagram at #InspireHealthPodcast. If you have a question that you'd like to be addressed, direct message me on Instagram or leave a comment on one of my posts. I would love to hear from you. And you can grab our show notes and free resources for each episode at inspirehealthpodcast.com. So be sure to go online and check it out.